Okay, welcome back, everybody. Um, we just ended with a little bit of gloom and doom, but I'm more of a glass half full guy. This session is on producing research that is useful and used, and I'm sure we'll hear some things both about what makes for cases where research isn't used, but also I think some things that will help us understand ways in which we as people doing educational research can make our work be something that would be useful and used. As you may have noticed, the program says this is chaired by Eva Baker. I am not Eva Baker. I'm Bob Floden from Michigan State University. I'm not happy that Eva can't be here. She had a back issue, but I'm happy to be a part of this panel. Educational research, the fact that we do educational research, not just social science research or humanities research, carries with it the idea of improvement. That is, that we want to do things that are going to make a difference in improving the lives of people, students in particular, but also the broader population. John Dewey said that the idea of, when John Dewey talked about education isn't just change, it isn't just how people do things differently, it isn't even just learning, it's about learning things that enable people to keep on growing. Dewey also believed that the way in which things improved, including things in education, was when people learned from evidence. He talked about the importance of scientific inquiry in a very general sense, not in the narrow sense we heard about in some of the history yesterday. So it's important to bring Dewey in here as somebody who both thought very much about education and the importance of moving in a positive direction and in learning from experience. Yesterday, we heard some things about focused on methods and how methods might be connected to how our work is or isn't used. Today, we're going to be not just hearing from people doing research, but also from perhaps predominantly from the people on the other side, from people who do work in policy and study policy. This connection to policy and doing work, research work that's important for policy is an important thing for the National Academy of Education. I'm the chair of our Research Advisory Committee. One of the things we do is provide advice to the board on what sort of projects the Academy should take on. And in making those decisions, one of the most important things is whether the work is something that's important to do, where importance carries with it both the idea that it would add to knowledge and that it would be something that would make a difference, particularly in areas like policy and practice. And we have taken on a number of projects like that. We put together some policy white papers a few years ago. I worked with one of the members of the panel here on a project on the evaluation of teacher preparation programs. The full introductions for the people on the panel are in your packets. I'll say just a few words about each of them, and then we're going to have a format similar to the previous panel. We'll have 3 speakers, each speaking for about 15 minutes, and then 2 people who are respondents. We're going to go from my right to left, your left to right, across here, which is a slight change from the order in the program. Cohn has done various things, including being a superintendent in Long Beach and San Diego. He's now with the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and one of the things that I have in mind when I think of him is the strong relationship that he had, I know about particularly when he was at Long Beach, but perhaps in other contexts as well, of collaborating with people and making use of research. Jeanne Burns is with the Louisiana Board of Regents. She served as part of the team that the National Academy put together to do the work on the evaluation of teacher preparation programs, and that's a part of the work that she has done. So she's been a participant in putting together reports that draw on research, and one of her roles in that was always to push us to say, so what should somebody do on the basis of the things that we know? Jeff Henig at Teachers College Columbia studies how research is used, so he's bringing that perspective to the work. And then the two respondents, we have Adam Gamoran, member of the Academy, and now the president of the W.T. Grant Foundation, one of the missions of which is to fund research on the use of research evidence in education, or maybe more broadly, use of research evidence. And then Jack Jennings, another Academy member who worked for many years on the Hill here in D.C. and then ran a very highly regarded Center for Policy Analysis here in the district. So without further ado, we'll start with Carl Cohn.
Thank you. This is the beginning of the optimism panel.
Yes.
So if Eva Baker were here, I would publicly thank her for the role that she played when I was a rookie superintendent back in the early 90s. Our director of research was retiring. We were getting about $1 million a year, which was a lot of money in those days, from the Clark Foundation of New York. And the program officer, who had become our critical friend when our director of research retired, said to me, you know, you might actually want to hire someone who knows a lot about research and evaluation. And I turned to Eva Baker for advice about who that should be, and she sent us Lynn Winters, who was one of her lieutenants at Cress, and Lynn became our assistant superintendent, research and evaluation, and absolutely changed the trajectory of our school system. We had not done a lot with data and assessment. She had the uncanny ability to make accountability teacher and principal friendly. She could go out to schools and win over the people who were actually doing the work. And the first thing they would hit her with was, we don't like the Sat 9, which is what the state of California was using at the time. And Lynn said, well, if you don't like the Sat 9, we actually know how to develop assessments that are a better measure of what you're actually doing. And that would stop people in their tracks. And so we started a whole system of recognition and reward for those who were actually performing on assessments other than the state mandated assessment. And it actually changed the view of everyone with regard to what was possible. So if Eva were here, I would be thanking her again for that. What I'm doing now is I'm part of a grand experiment in California. It's truly gratifying to work for a governor who is skeptical about both Washington and state capitals. He, in June of 2013, signed historic legislation that changes both school finance and governance in California. Got rid of more than 20 state categorical programs and is providing compensatory investments in kids who are poor, learning English, or in foster care. And the more kids you have, the more supplemental and concentration grants you get that bolsters your financial bottom line. The other thing that this legislation did, it required a return to local control as the vehicle of governance, and that was to be represented by a local control and accountability plan, what we call an LCAP, and that LCAP is supposed to have broad stakeholder participation. Governor Brown is placing a big bet on the principle of subsidiarity, sometimes viewed as a rather obscure organizing principle. It's actually rooted in both Catholic social teaching and American libertarian thought. The idea that the lowest level of government, the level that's closest to the people, holds the greatest potential to deliver the service, and that poor people and those who are economically marginalized should not have to rely on ever higher levels of government to speak for them. I know a bit about the principle of subsidiarity because, just like the governor, I studied to be a priest before I got into public life. So I'm a huge fan of the principle of subsidiarity. Most of the attention on this historic legislation was on the changes in both finance and governance. And ultimately, in 2021, when we get to the full rollout of this change, an additional $18 billion a year will be invested in kids who are poor, learning English, and in foster care. One of the little-known features of this legislation was the creation of a new state agency independent of the California Department of Education, whose purpose is to assist districts, charters, and county offices of education who are not meeting their academic performance goals. And so I've been asked to head up this new state agency. So far, I'm the only employee, which is different from my usual jobs. So when I'm driving to work, I'm the only person I have to worry about, rather than the usual 4,000 or 5,000 people who might be screwing up and getting in trouble. So, what will this mouthful, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, what will it need from the research community? The collaborative, CCEE, and I'll refer to it as the collaborative, it has an underpinning philosophy that's been developed largely by Michael Floden, Linda Darling-Hammond, and David Plank. They've provided philosophical underpinnings for the approach that the collaborative is going to take. The short version is the right drivers of reform: capacity building, local ownership, pedagogy, social capital, system coherence, shared expertise. And you're welcome to presume that we're going to stay away from the wrong drivers of reform, which are memorialized and embodied in both No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. So this is, in many ways, Governor Brown's opportunity to move California forward on its own terms, not waiting for reauthorization or new messages from the feds. We are moving forward as a state to determine our own future with regard to school improvement. So these are some of the research questions that we will need help from you all on. Does school spending in terms of compensatory investments in low-income students, does it matter? I recently read a piece in Education Next by Jackson, Johnson, and Persico arguing that it does. And so we'll want, she gave me the 5-minute thing. I'm like, really? We will want help on this fundamental issue. Secondly, what do we know about increased stakeholder engagement at the local level with regard to its influence on student performance? Is this big bet going to pay off? Third, how do the new governance and finance changes interact with all of the other simultaneous changes in play in California schools? So just to review, we have new standards, both Common Core and next generation science standards. We have new assessments, Smarter Balance. We have new approaches to discipline. I just chaired a statewide task force on effective school discipline practices, trying to alter or slow the so-called pipeline to prison. And then just completed chairing a new statewide task force on new approaches to serving students with disabilities, arguing that the vast majority of kids with disabilities ought to be educated in regular gen ed classrooms. So the landscape of change is absolutely unprecedented and extraordinary. Fourth question that you can help us with. And how are all of these changes actually having an impact on what goes on in schools and classrooms? Fifth, what does the research tell us about the effectiveness of sharing, pairing schools, bringing schools together in collaborating? And finally, what does the research tell us about building a better, stronger teacher workplace, which I would argue ultimately will be the real test of whether or not we will move all of this forward in California. I would tell you a brief story about my first year as superintendent in San Diego. Did you already give me the 2 minute? No. You did? Okay. So I called together, first year superintendent in San Diego, I called together all the national board certified teachers. And I give them something to eat, I give them a drink, and I say, what would it take for you to leave the safe confines of your current assignment and come to a place where the district really needs your skills? And they looked at me and they said, Mr. New Superintendent, are you aware that the most tyrannical principals in the district are at the schools that you want us to go to. Prescriptive teaching, all of the things that we, as National Board Certified Teachers, abhor are present in those schools south of Interstate 8 in the urban core of San Diego. So what are you going to do to change that dynamic to build a stronger, more professional teacher workplace where National Board Certified Teachers would want to come? So as you can see, I'm very optimistic about where California is, but we're absolutely going to need the help of the research community to really move this forward. Thank you.
Jeanne?
I've been very fortunate because I've had the opportunity to conduct my own research as a professor, and for the last 15 years, I have been a strong advocate at the state level within the Board of Regents to use research as policies are being made within the state of Louisiana. When I prepared my remarks for today, I decided that I was going to focus on a couple of areas that we have found to be very important in order to have research actually make it to the point of becoming part of policy within our state. The areas that I'm going to be identifying are ones that I think are very important for pre-doctoral students, for postdoctoral students, as well as for senior researchers, senior scholars that are here in the room today. I want to really stress the fact that when you're able to bring about changes within individual states, other states become very interested in the work that you're doing, and you also gain attention at the national level. So don't look upon work occurring at a state level where your research is being used as not being as productive as if it's not being used at a more national level. The first area that we have found to be very important within our state as it relates to researchers is that it's very important for researchers to be directly engaged in work that is occurring with commissions, councils, task forces that are addressing important issues within the state. You just heard Carl talk about the fact that he's been involved in a number of different task forces within our state, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples for each of these important items. But within our state, we actually developed a commission back in 1999 that met through 2010. That commission had a focus upon looking at ways to improve student learning by better preparing new teachers and more effective leaders. 1/3 of the commission was made up of higher ed, 1/3 of key leaders in our state, and 1/3 that was made up of K through 12 leaders. That particular commission developed recommendations each year, it had a different focus each year, that went to a meeting of our joint Board of Regents and Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. And they in turn directed staff to identify ways in order to implement the recommendations. Those commissions, the commission over the various years, were actually very, very important, and researchers had a very important part of those commissions. Number one, we put university faculty with research backgrounds on the commissions over the various years, to especially if they had research in the area in which we were investigating problems or issues or needs within the state. Those researchers helped to identify other researchers who could come and speak to the commission members so the commission would be informed when it reached the point of having to make policy decisions. Those particular researchers also could talk about not only the cognitive aspects of the research that they were doing, but the affective aspects, and that sometimes had a greater impact upon some of those key state policy leaders, K through 12 leaders, than the cognitive aspects of the research that was occurring. I cannot emphasize enough how important that type of interaction was to have our state move forward with some of the decisions that were made within the state. It was time consuming, but it really had an impact. I know all of your states have commissions and councils. I've been invited to go and speak in various states on those commissions and councils. And so I really recommend that you reach out, identify when various councils are going to be created, set up, talk to state leaders, let them know your area of expertise, and then see if it's possible for you to become part of those particular commissions, councils, task forces. The second area that I think is very important to share with you that you should be thinking about, and that is that you need to be proactive. With the commission, people could talk about existing research, but you need to be stepping out. You need to be approaching state leaders about new research that needs to occur within your states. Or you need to look at an expansion of an area in which you might have conducted research, but you would like to see it expanded over and beyond just a small sample of individuals who are involved in your research. Within our state, and I'm not sure after the previous panel I want to talk about this, but it was very important for our state. Within our state, we have done a lot of work in the area of using value-added data to look at the effectiveness of our teacher preparation programs and to identify patterns that help us to understand where we need to go in and look at making improvements to our teacher preparation programs. That work did not start and happen all at one time. Dr. George Knoll, who is a researcher at LSU, was working within our state at that time. We heard needs coming from our universities about needing to have data that was connected to the impact of learning of children, of new teachers that had completed programs at the universities. That was a need that was identified by our council. And this whole line of research started with George Knoll and I going to our state superintendent and our state commissioner and indicating to them that there was a need for research in this area. We went to them with a plan for a pilot and discussed how it could have a positive impact upon what was going on within our state. What ended up happening was our state superintendent at that time did not feel politically it was the right time to be doing something with all teachers within the state, but he was willing to share data that could then be used by teacher preparation programs. Funding was located in order for Dr. Knoll to be able to go ahead and develop a model. Funding was provided for the model to be tested with 10 school districts the first year, all school districts the next year, and then we ended up having an actual model be used from 2006 through 2010, where we could provide our universities with information pertaining to how children were performing, who were being taught by their new teachers. Again, this would not have occurred had we not gone to the state superintendent and the commissioner of higher ed with an idea that supported needs that were being identified within the state. 3, it is very important for you to have a united voice instead of a single voice. Within our state, we work very closely with all our College of Education deans at all our public universities. We also work with the deans, even though Board of Regents are not over private universities, but we involve them in discussions dealing with teacher preparation. Our College of Education deans were very instrumental in helping us get a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York that would look at factors that impact the effectiveness of new teachers. We ended up having, as part of that grant, where a researcher from every institution came together, identified specific needs, developed many studies, went out, actually implemented the studies, and then came back with recommendations for what we needed to do within our state in order to bring about changes to procedures, to policies, to laws. We had one team that recognized the fact that the value-added overall scores being provided to universities, that they were not enough. They needed drill-down data that went into content areas, went into grade spans, and they even wanted data that went down to the level of individual teachers de-identified, how well the students on the average did in specific strands on the state achievement tests. They came up with a model for how that could actually be implemented, and our state adopted that model. So since that time period, all of our universities get drill down data that take the information to that level. We have found that they thought they were doing fine, but when they looked at patterns and they went back and looked at what was happening in their programs, they actually found that there were weaknesses. That was a united voice. Third, you need to make sure that as you have ideas that pertain to research, that you need to have impact policy, that you're being persistent. But you have to also understand that timing is an issue. As an example, 2 years ago, we actually developed a bill to take to the legislature that was based upon, again, needs being identified by our university faculty and researchers. They wanted personally identifiable data about completers from the teacher preparation programs. It was not politically the right time for us to take forth a bill at that time because of issues dealing with Common Core and personally identifiable data of students. We held off, but the need has developed once again. Next week, our Commissioner of Higher Education is going to be meeting with an advisory council that we have that formed by the Board of Regents to have an exploratory discussion pertaining to all of our universities having personally identifiable data for research purposes for their candidates and their completers that can be used for program improvement and, again, research purposes. Timing is critical. The fifth one here and the last one is you need to make sure that you're being transparent with the use of your data. Our College of Education deans and our universities are very unique. They are open to sharing data about their teacher preparation programs. We have a data dashboard that was released last year for the first time. As part of the data dashboard, it is identifying relevant information that's accurate pertaining to what is occurring within the teacher preparation programs within our state. Our College of Education deans and faculty were involved in the development of the indicators that we're using. It's been interesting because the data went out last year, but we're finding that the public doesn't know how to interpret the data. So we now have university faculty, College of Ed deans, our council member will be providing input, districts will be providing input, where we're going to be taking a look at how we can identify levels to help the public understand about what's happening within our teacher preparation programs. And we have some positive information that we're sharing, that's being shared with the public, and it's primarily due to the fact that all of our universities underwent redesign, addressing more rigorous standards, and they're very willing to share their results with the public. Just one final point, and I am going to close because my time is up here, but one final point that I think is also important is it was mentioned that I had participated on with the task force, the group that developed a report dealing with valuation of teacher preparation programs. Our state actually took a decision framework that was generated as a result of that report, and we actually implemented it this past year. And on Wednesday of this week, we ended up revising a policy dealing with the evaluation of our teacher preparation programs that we already had on the books for the Board of Regents. We redid the guidelines, and our universities were involved in the decision-making that occurred in order to create that. So I just want to end by saying that all of your states have advocates at the state level who understand the value of research. Find those people. Share what you are doing with those particular people. And again, I'm talking from a state level, but I really want to emphasize that if you can bring about changes at the state level that are found to be effective, then those changes are going to be shared with other states because of requests coming from other states, and it will also be shared at the national level. So you can have an impact even if you start working at a state level. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I come at this from a different perspective. I'm a political scientist who's looked at the politics of how research gets used, particularly when it comes to hot-button issues, and in this case, charter schools. And I'll draw on that a little bit in my remarks, but just to make a connection, because I'm going to have some things to say about timing that are, some are a little bit different than Jeanne's, but Jeanne's point about timing matters. That also, echoes things Carol Weiss, one of the early and important researchers on the issue of research utilization, talked about, which is if you want your research to be relevant, you've got to deliver it at the time that policymakers are interested in it. But I just want to start by saying the time that policymakers are interested in your research is often the time when the political landmines are most intense, and the chances that it will be met by strange dynamics as a result are highest. So I'm going to very briefly make some points from what I saw in the study of use of research in charter schools, give a very stylized presentation on some differences between how I think researchers look at issues like time and causality versus how elected in particular policymakers do, and offer some thoughts about what we should do about it. But my thoughts are less about what individual researchers, what you all might want to do, because my answer, as you'll see, is that we actually want people to do different things, but more from the standpoint of what the enterprise of education research should do. So I'll just very briefly say, so in my book, Spin Cycle, I focused initially on a case of a study of charter schools that had been actually conducted by the AFT and ended up on the front page of the New York Times, above the fold, as journalists like to talk about, and that said, charter schools trail in results, and portrayed this as a blow to the Bush administration. And that set off a storm of response and counter-response. Within 8 days, organized by a pro-charter organization, a group of 31 researchers had signed on to a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal that was not one of these ads with big text, but real small text that read like a primer on research methods and sort of took piece by piece what was wrong with this study. And concluded that it does not meet professional research standards and as a result does not tell us anything. And that was subsequently met by, as you can imagine, counter arguments, including researchers pulling out individual signatories to that document and giving instances where they had published research that failed to meet the criteria laid out in the ad. So the first point is that about research in the public eye is it's often very polarized. It can be very personalized. Arguments about research methods can be used as ammunition, not so much to inform audiences about the limitations of knowledge as to discredit and dismiss studies and the researchers who conducted them. Just two quotes to illustrate this. One, a researcher who I interviewed said, well, when someone brings a knife to a fight, you'd better bring a knife too, which spoke to the acceleration of this kind of process. And then what I was very concerned about, which is how this public presentation of these debates affects the public's view of research. Someone not a researcher, but someone involved in education community said, oh God, these researchers, these social scientists, piddling and piddling, and one day it's this, and one day it's that, a pox on all your houses. So I do think that there's a cost to this high visibility, high polarized presentation. But one of the arguments I make in the book, and what I think is even more true now, reflecting back some 25 years after the start of the charter school movement, is under the radar screen, the research was was going ahead, and it was getting better. The research was maturing, it was getting more precise, and even has led over time to convergence on some issues, and certainly for ruling out some of the extreme views on either side. I won't go into the details again just because of time, but over time we got better data on charter schools, partly for independent reasons and partly because people pursued the better data to answer the questions. We got better conceptualization so that where early on the argument was about charters as a homogeneous group versus public schools as a homogeneous group, and over time we began to look at distinctions among both groups. We had more studies in more places, so there was more understanding and actual evidence about the role that context plays, including whether enrollments are increasing or decreasing in an area, including what the state laws actually were. And as I said, the extreme predictions on both sides ended up being challenged, and challenged in a way that people accepted on both sides. And I'll just briefly say a couple of these. Early on, a lot of the concern, including mine, was about that charter schools would be systematically creaming the best and more affluent students because those would be the easiest to educate and the most likely to have high test scores, and that did not turn out to be the case. On the other side, there was a lot of expectation at the beginning that parents would leave bad schools. That was the point of charter schools, to bring market forces to bear, and over time charter advocates had to acknowledge that in fact parents often loyally stayed in bad charter schools, and that test scores did not soar, and that indeed, if we look at it now, what's most clear from the evidence is that there's huge variation within both sectors, much more variation than there is difference at the median. So the point I want to make here is the distinction between the core enterprise of research, which I think was healthy and progressed the way we'd like to think it ought to, and how research was presented and disseminated within the public sphere, where media, foundations, advocacy groups, bloggers, and others played an important role. Now, research think versus political think. I'm going to go through this quickly so I can set up some concluding points, and please, know from the beginning that I know this is an oversimplification. On time, researchers tend to think about time in terms of getting it right, and in a lot of questions that means longitudinal studies. It takes time to set them up. We're not going to be able to create a study and turn around the results right away. Policymakers tend to think about time as we need it now. Multiple studies. Researchers tend to think about research as accumulation of studies over time, what we learn from multiple studies that use somewhat different methods or do try to replicate one another, whereas policymakers tend to think about which one is right. Causality. Researchers are just taught that causality is fundamentally problematic in a multi-causal world, that a lot of our energy and efforts is really focused on untangling issues of causality. Policymakers tend to think about causality as sequence, this came before that, or correlation plus a good story. Abstraction. Researchers tend to think about abstraction as required in order to find general patterns in a complex world, whereas policymakers tend to think about abstraction as a simplification that denies the complexities of real life. And simplification as a point itself, researchers tend to deal with simplification through abstraction, whereas policymakers often tend to deal with simplification through get the gist. Now, my point is not that these are one's right or one's wrong. I think these different perspectives are based in different background training and, importantly, institutional incentives and the demands of the primary responsibilities of researchers versus policymakers, which are different and which necessitate a different perspective. So what should we do about all this as an enterprise? And here's where I think I'd differ on some issues from what the common answer is, and maybe the dominant one now, which is that we need to sort of shift our game plan to meet the policymakers. And I guess the theme of my point now would be we do need to meet policymakers halfway, but not more than halfway. Okay? So And that means, we're doing a lot of things. We're training policy analysts, our young policy analysts, to do policy briefs, distill everything down to a couple of lines, to talk differently about policy, to turn around quick studies in some instances, or do critiques of studies within a week so we can get it while the media attention is still high. I don't think all of that's wrong-headed, but I do want to say from a societal point of view, more might be gained by maintaining the distinctions between academic, applied, and advocacy research. Just as in a musical choir, the chorus depends on the blending of distinct voices rather than recruiting a group of singers, each reasonably able to sing high and low notes. That doesn't mean there should be no discourse between researchers and policy actors. There needs to be. But the institutions that distinguish them should be differentiated and not eroded, I would argue. Rather than seeking overlapping ways of thinking, we should cultivate the differences and then build mechanisms with specific task of bridging an issue that I'll return to if I've got time, and I do. Secondly, redefining policy relevance. I'd like to say don't mistake political time for policy time. So I think on this issue there's researcher time, which is slow arc over time. Yesterday we're still talking about the Cohn report, for example. And there's political time, which is needed now. But there's also policy time, and I want to suggest policy time comes closer to the middle or maybe even towards the arc of researcher time. So the issues we're dealing with today and that we've heard about the last couple of days, the role of schools versus the role of inequality, the role of race versus class, technical solutions based on accountability and efficiency and expertise versus those rooted in culture and identity. All these range of issues are not new. We play them out over a long time. The charter school research as a case in point, the first charters were 1990. People wanted to know then, are they working or are they not? As I said, I think we know a lot more about that now. We still don't know very much about it 25 years later. But the policy world ebbs and flows, and windows of opportunity to influence policy change. They close, but they also reopen. And I'd use an analogy here. This may be the most practical advice to the young scholars. It's about investments, right? If you talk to, when you've got money to invest in stocks and you talk to someone who studies this stuff, they'll tell you what you don't want to do is try to time the market. What you want to do is have a diverse portfolio. And I think that's how we should think about this in terms of the research enterprise, not trying to jump on the issues that are hot right now, but have people doing research on different arcs of time that some of them will mature at the right time when people want to hear about it. Third, I'd say dispense with the mystique of the killer study. I think we tend to fall into sometimes ourselves, certainly others do, the media and others, with the idea that if we had just the best study, the best methods, the best data, the biggest study with the most sites, we can answer the question. I want to go back to the point that research, I think, is cumulative. All research involves judgments and trade-offs. Measures are always imprecise. Elements of the context are always unaccounted for, and the context is always changing. So I think we'd make a big step towards more informed democratic deliberation if we could get the media, foundations, and political leaders to understand this, that no one study nails the issue, that the accumulation of studies does inform, but it doesn't settle or lead unambiguously to prescription. And finally, I want to say something about what I'll call modesty in claims, but maybe it's a false modesty a little bit. When policymakers say they need the information and they need it now, I think we as an enterprise, must sometimes be ready to tell them honestly that the information they want does not yet exist. When funders or the media say they need a sharp and definitive and broadly stated lesson, we sometimes need to hold our ground and say that available evidence only permits tentative, contingent, and qualified conclusions. Now, to some, I think this will sound like a recipe for irrelevance, but I think we should be more confident in challenging the notion of relevance that's dominated simply by political actors' immediate needs. And moreover, I think failing to honestly present the challenges and complexities of the research enterprise carries its own risks of irrelevance as well if we begin to look too much like the think tanks and the quick turnaround joints and reinforce this notion of piddling and back and forth and a pox on all your houses. Thank you.
Adam?
Well, it's very challenging to follow such thoughtful statements on an issue of perennial interest. For as long as there has been research on education, there has been interest in the use of evidence from research on education in making decisions that affect policy and practice. And yet this perennial problem has yet to be reconciled with the way work actually goes on in decision-making context. Just to give one of many examples, one of our grantees recently reported that her team had analyzed the applications for waivers from the No Child Left Behind regulations. And these are developing state accountability systems, highly consequential for the states. Virtually no reference to research finding in any of the applications or in any of the materials that led to those deliberations. So this is an ongoing challenge, and has been an issue for 120 years, something like that. I think, though, we're hearing the glimmers of a historic shift in today's comments and in developments in the research world. A move from what makes research useful to how to create the structures, incentives, and relationships in which research is routinely used. And that's, I think, the direction we need to go. Until now, most of the attention in response to this question about how to produce research that is useful and used has focused on the quality of the research, highlighted by the emphasis in the Institute of Education Sciences when it was established in 2001 towards developing, supporting the accumulation of evidence that could be believable, that could be trustworthy about its assertions about cause and effect. But it turns out that producing high quality evidence is neither necessary nor sufficient for research to be used in policy and practice decisions. It's not necessary because, as Jeff's work has pointed out, and as you alluded to today, there's a lot of bad evidence that's used in policy deliberations. And it's not sufficient because, as we can see, despite the increased production of believable, of credible conclusions about cause and effect, research is rarely consulted when decisions are made, usually after the decision to justify the decision. So the focus on the quality of the evidence is not sufficient to help us understand how to produce evidence that's used. Even the new developments subsequently at the Institute of Education Sciences under John Easton's leadership, who's here today, which have focused on greater relevance of evidence, is also not sufficient unless they are accompanied by the kinds of relationships that support the use of evidence that is both high quality and relevant. Since 2009, the William T. Grant Foundation has supported a funding program on the use of research evidence. Much of that work has been in education. I can't take credit for this. I arrived in 2013, but I'll take credit for it moving forward. Our grantees have shown that the use of research evidence is not primarily about the quality of evidence, nor of any feature of the evidence itself. Instead, it's about the relationships between producers and consumers of evidence and intermediaries that often bridge the gap between the two. And it's about the structures that support those relationships, and it's about the quality of relationships, especially the degree to which there is trust in relationships between producers, consumers, and intermediaries when it comes to research evidence. Now, for a couple of examples, I'll talk about research practice partnerships, which are a particular type of structure in education, common and increasingly common in education, that provides the kinds of structures that lends themselves to the use of research evidence when decisions are made. There are many examples. The longest standing is the Consortium for Chicago School Research. There's the Research Alliance for New York City Schools, and there are similar partnerships arising all over the country, in Houston, in Dallas, in New Orleans, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore. This is an increasingly common phenomenon. As Ruth Turley at Rice University and Carla Stevens in the Houston Independent School District have jointly written, there are advantages to both districts and universities in creating these partnerships. From the district side, they have a mountain of data, but rarely do they have the kind of capacity that Carl described to make use of those data for decision making. Moreover, there are advantages to school districts to having an independent eye and an independent adjudication of the evidence that's yielded by the school district data. From the university standpoint, the partnership not only provides access to the data, but it provides a context in which questions that are of consequence to the school district and therefore useful from the research side can be asked. Moreover, the research practice partnership gives the university an opportunity to engage with its local community in a way that many universities, perhaps most universities, lack. Two advantages to the research practice partnership. One is that it provides a context for co-constructing the questions that are asked. And this relationship makes it more likely that the questions that are asked, which when they yield answers, will be of more use, more value to decision makers in the school district. And at the same time, the partnership can help create a culture of evidence, and I think we heard some of this from both Carl's comments and Jeanne's, a culture of evidence in which a decision-making body regards evidence from research as a valuable source of information to consider, not determinative, but to consider when making decisions about moving forward. The key word here is engagement. So we're trying to move from a model of dissemination, where researchers figure something out, throw it over the wall, and hope that it will be found, to a model of engagement, where there's an active relationship or partnership between researchers and decision makers who could potentially take use of the findings to make decisions. An active engagement that would increase both the appreciation for research on the part of decision makers and the likelihood that the questions asked by researchers will be of interest to those making decisions. And our foundation has developed a micro website for resources for research practice partnerships, how to establish them, what the advantages are, what some pitfalls are, sample memoranda of understanding, all sorts of resources that can be useful in establishing these partnerships. Now, a second example is the role of intermediaries. And Jeff briefly alluded to a number of examples: advocacy groups, foundations, think tanks, all sorts of groups that take the role of synthesizing and transferring research evidence from the producer to the potential consumer of research. At its best, intermediaries understand the needs of policymakers, are honest brokers of research evidence, and facilitate exchanges between decision makers and researchers. Now, intermediaries act in many different ways. So the question we have to ask is, under what conditions can intermediaries serve these roles of an honest brokership of research evidence and establish a trust with decision makers that is warranted by such brokering? A key to this set of relationships is the quality of trust. As another one of our grantees, Robert Asen, has recently written in a new book that's just about to come out called Democracy, Deliberation, and Education. Because research use occurs in human relationships and is built up through repeated interaction, trust is the essential quality of relationship that supports its use. And so, as a result of these findings, our foundation is bringing a shift in our focus for this long-standing emphasis on the use of research evidence. We're going to be coming out this fall with a new request for applications that will focus on, first, research that helps us understand how to create the structure and relationship that support the use of research evidence. We've come a long way from understanding the barriers to the use of research evidence and the need for improved quality of evidence to understanding some of the conditions that support the use of research evidence, as I've outlined. But what we need to know next is how to create those conditions. It's all well and good to say, well, a partnership is the way to foster engagement. But how do you create that partnership? What elements does it need to have, and how do you establish trust in the relationship? These are questions that need to be answered. And second, we hope to support research that will test an assumption that I think this panel implicitly accepts, and many in the research community accept, that if decisions are based on evidence, that the outcomes of those decisions will be better for kids. That's an assumption and needs to be tested. So if school districts consider evidence when setting policies and choosing programs, the better outcomes for kids will ensue. And we hope to support research that will investigate those questions. We recognize that the decisions are always made in a political context, and research evidence is never going to be decisive. What we should hope for is that evidence from research will be at the table when decisions are made. Otherwise, what are we doing? A better understanding of how to create these conditions will improve the value of the research we're conducting and improve outcomes for kids.
Chad?
Thank you. Well, let me see how I can use my 5 minutes. There was some discussion with this panel about trying to produce something that would help fellows or graduate students who are thinking of doing research that was relevant to daily practice. So I was trying to think, listening to the comments here, how could something be written, maybe a pamphlet be written? And originally I was thinking of calling it CURT, C-U-R-T, but then I heard more comments and I thought maybe it's CURTER, C-U-R-T-E-R. But let me tell you what I think we've heard. One is, starting at the end of the word, R. I think if research is meant to be used in policy, I think there should be a review to make sure that it is correctly used. Or if it is being used and it isn't having the results you want, that you move to something else. And so I think I got that from Adams's comments as well as from Jeff's comments. With an E, I would say maybe that's the environment, and that's Jeff's comments, I think, and some others, where Jeff was saying, well, if you're using research in a practical situation, you might be in a very political situation, and research may be used as a weapon rather than as something that'll change practice. So that's something to be aware of. And Jeff also, I think, cautioned us, again, in the environment, that it's hard to have a straight line from research to a policy change. For 17 years, I lived on foundation money, and I refused government money, refused any other money, and it was only foundation money. And some of the foundations said, well, we'll give you money, but you have to show your policy change with the money. And I said, well, I can't. I mean, I can't say that I got $100,000 and we got this bill passed. Now, some lobbyists might say that, but I couldn't say that because we were producing reports, and I couldn't say, well, here's a direct line to a change. You can't create an environmental change where people will discuss certain things in different ways but not directly change. So that's a caution. Then if we go to R, another, well, T, timeliness. I think Carl is very timely because he's about ready to monitor and try to help people who are going to deal with a lot of money that they didn't have before, and hopefully they'll do it the right way, and very relevant too, because this is happening immediately. Jeanne, I think, is talking about using research in a very relevant way, very timely way, by asking people to look at what commissions are meeting and you talked about how you have the researchers talk to the commissioners and talk to the commissions. Well, sometimes that would be a U, which is that if research is used, it should be understandable. And research is not always understandable. So that's another caution. And then the last is a C, going backwards again, C, which is that research has to reach a conclusion. I realize some research isn't necessarily meant to reach a conclusion or it can't reach a conclusion, but if you can't reach a conclusion, you should say it. But if you want your work to be used, you have to reach a conclusion that's understandable in the English language and is understandable by policymakers. And so if I were to add anything, it would be that there should be some pamphlet or something for people interested in applying research to policy. Curter pamphlet, C-U-R-T-E-R. And that's what I took out of the panel.
So I'm just going to ask one question, and then we'll throw it open for questions. And this is, I think, so time is something that's come up over and over again. And I'm going to ask you, Carl. So you're just starting on this enterprise. You have lots of questions, and I wonder if you could just say a little bit about, which or how it is that researchers might be used helpful in the short run, and how are there things that they might do where they would have a little more time to work on things?
One of the bets within this bigger bet is that schools and school districts with similar demographics can learn from each other. And so I would want to know, to what extent is that plausible, and what are the difficult aspects of that? So if you've got two schools with the same demographics, and one is in Long Beach and the other's in Fresno, and one is outperforming the other, to what extent does the research tell us that pairing of those two schools, giving them additional resources to work on challenges, to what extent is that effective? And so learning more about that would be very helpful in the short run.
So I'm listening to Jeanne and you and the other comments as well. It seems like there are a couple of ways in which researchers can be helpful, and one is drawing on what is already known and having a conversation with you or you saying, well, here's what I think we know about this, and the other is actually doing new work, which takes longer, and you have to wait for that. Go ahead.
Can I say more? The other thing that's important, so California is moving to a new accountability system that includes 8 state priorities, starting with focus on implementation of standards, a whole host of other things, but to include social emotional learning. And what I would argue that we have to get to, if we're really going to stick with multiple measures, just like the recent Smarter Balance results were front page above the fold, we have to get to how things like social emotional learning, progress in that area, or progress in reducing suspensions and expulsions, how does that story get to front page above the fold in terms of the amount of money that will be saved with regard to incarceration, lifetime of unemployment? Part of what we have to do, if we're really committed to these multiple measures, is to get a degree of gravity around those kinds of messages that are then displayed to the public, much like poor performance on tests are. And
it just calls to mind that, speaking about intermediaries, intermediaries we heard about before were between the researchers and the policy people. But there's another sort of intermediary, which are the people that figure out how to do communication to the public, marketing, sales, those sorts of things, how to craft a message so it's not just understandable, but it's something that grips the public imagination.
If I could just add to what you just said and that Carl said, and Adam made a couple of points that I thought were very, very relevant, and this didn't come out when I initially talked about the commission within our state, but it relates to the points that were made. When we have formed commissions, we have had on the commissions teacher union, representative, presidents, school boards, with Principals Association. We've had Teachers of the Year. It's been a very, very diverse group where people do not all agree. And that has been very, very important because what happens is you get out on the table what the key issues are that need to be resolved or that need to be altered in some type of way in order to better meet the needs of children. And the point that was made where you need to have the K through 12 community and the researchers in higher education where they are talking together with each other instead of across each other. And I think that's the value of having commissions, task forces, councils. If you're bringing together diverse perspectives where everyone is learning in the process, and then what ends up being created as a policy, procedures, guidelines, end up being something that people understand and they support. And over the years, those commissions, and now we have an advisory council, have been really critical when it has come to the point of implementation. Because we're not about using research for the purpose of creating policy. We are using research for the purpose of having policy that then has a positive impact upon learning of children within our state. So it all needs to come together, and it can't be done overnight. The trust issue that you talked about is a really critical issue. And people start to trust each other when they start to openly talk about issues and develop an understanding of the different perspectives that might be sitting around the table. So I was really glad that you brought out that issue of trust. But again, trust does not happen overnight.
So we have about half an hour. Questions, comments? Maris?
I'm Maris Tanaskis, University of Michigan, and I want to give you a different way, not better, just different. And that's that the intermediary person can actually become an expert. I mean, the assumption is that you become an expert and then you do these things. In my own life, I started out as a 5-year-old in this country in a conservative state, Nebraska, got a PhD in history, quantitative behavioral work though, and then what do? And so what I did is, as either my hobby or the fact that I was born to live through the 60s when we were going to help the poor. And I don't think we've done a great job of it. But if you start with that, you look for opportunities and you latch on to opportunities. And so in the last 25 years, in terms of Washington, I have been working both with Republicans and Democrats, both in the House as a congressional staff, but mainly working as a policy analyst for Democrats and Republicans. I started out in adolescent pregnancy and family planning in both the different types of administrations, and did work on that and published off that and became quite good at it. When I went in to start that topic, I knew nothing about adolescent pregnancy. And that's not unusual because that's what a lot of people do. But if the kind of training we have, the kinds of things we do, you can see how you can do something with that. And I don't have time, and I'm not going to go through the details. And I was very happy with that. I was doing my regular work, which if you want to stay in academia, you have to do. But soon this became the regular work. In the last 25 years now, in the last 15 years, I turned to education. and started working there, and again have had the chance to work with both Democrats and Republicans in the Department of Education and develop things. And by now, I think I am an expert in a lot of these things, but I wasn't when I started. But the strengths you have, you learn to navigate, and some of you have already said that, and Jack is an expert in this. You cite different things. The biggest thing is you need to know what's really going on. Who do you turn to, like the Academy, that you have some respect for, giving you a decent idea of what's really going on? Then, when you go talk to the people that you're working with, and these are not political appointees. I mean, I was not a political appointee. They were political appointees sometimes. Then you bring up certain pieces of evidence. You tell them there are others, but they need certain kinds of things when they write it up. And on some issues, there's no discussion. They know. But on a lot of issues, they don't know. And you can have a lot of influence. 5 or 6 times I almost left academia to take full-time jobs in either Democratic or Republican administration, mainly Republican in my case. And I decided not to do. Now, in retrospect, I think I did the right thing for myself. But one of the warnings I want to give you is you have chances in life. Take advantage of them. This is what you should do, is see alternatives. But don't think you're going to end up here, because these are people who succeeded. These are people who have either good academic jobs and all this, or good jobs out there. And the question is how you go about it and what you do. A lot of it is luck and chance. But your life is much more wide open than you suspect. At this point in my life, I've spent so much in education, that's going to be it. If it had been something else, that was not my goal. It was to help poor people.
Reactions from anyone in the panel?
Well, I would just add, I think this amplifies my comments about the potential role for intermediaries and the kinds of relationships and structures that support those relationships. People who are studying the kinds of activities Maris describes are using 2 main approaches, at least the work that we've supported. Case study approach, where they're focusing on particular organizations, in depth, or network analyses, where they're looking at the relationships among a wide range of actors. And both of these have been informative, but they're largely descriptive. And I think where we need to go next is, how do you induce the kinds of roles that you described in your comment?
Is that Kenji? No.
I hope I'm not cutting in line in front of Michael here.
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Kenji Hakuzet from Stanford. Thanks. Great set of perspectives, and I want to take advantage of this because some of you sit on state, boards, and Carl, you're participating in the sort of I learned a new term today about how you bring it down to the lowest political organization. And it's really kind of, we talk about college career ready and the Common Core rhetoric and so forth, and yet it's kind of ironic how sort of the role of higher education, and this is more around the research and the knowledge production and less around sort of what we think of as what happens after college career ready as you go to college and transition. And so I think there's sort of a thinking about sort of a demand side as well as production, that there's sort of disconnect between what happens in K-12 and what happens in higher ed. And yet we want to think about sort of the transition and who owns that problem. And I think within K-12 we can think about who owns the problem, but that transition piece, I think, is one where when we think about demand, we want to somehow find a policy actor for whom the stakes are around the transition, and how do we connect to that? I don't know if that's sort of a complicated space, but to me it just seems like an unaddressed part. We've got studies in higher ed, we've got stuff in K-12, but there are people certainly working in that space. But Mike Hurst recently, I was spending some time on a panel on this issue, and one of the ways in which he captured this was to say, there's nobody who gets fired or loses a job for that transition not happening, right? So anyway, that's just the if you could comment on some of this space, that'd be great.
Part of the beauty of Long Beach, in addition to our ties to UCLA in the person of Len Winters and the Kress Center, we also developed a partnership that endures to this day with both the community college and California State University, Long Beach, the Long Beach Education Partnership. And we all learned a great deal from that partnership, and we sort of coined the phrase seamless education. And what it suggested was that all three entities were going to take responsibility and accountability for that transition. I was absolutely struck by how much teachers across the levels wanted to work with each other, and we actually dramatically increased the performance of our students on the math and English language placement at California State University, Long Beach. So I think there are some examples of places that are doing a much better job of owning that transition.
I just want to say something that it's a reflection on both Maris's point and Kenji's, which is, but to underscore another issue, which is I think there are different roles and functions that research and researchers can play in informing public policy. And we tend to focus, because the policy world does, on the latest iteration and the latest interventions. So we're focused on Common Core testing, and or we're focusing on the current charter issue. And in many of the instances, what we have to offer is an accumulation of knowledge about analogous and earlier versions of these bigger ideas, the idea of accountability, the idea of markets versus government, the idea of common standards versus localized defined standards. And that's a role that someone needs to play too. So the research partnership, practice partnerships are about constructing a research agenda around current needs. Someone else also needs to be the folks who can sort of say, hey, there are things we can learn about, let's say, charter management organizations by studying health management organizations, which had a longer history. Or we can learn, there are current versions of focus on cross-sector collaboration. I've involved in a project to study collective impact, which is this term that emerged in 2011 out of nowhere, and people, treat it as if it's brand new, and yet it's rooted in things that have happened over time and for decades. And I guess my point is, again, different researchers by inclination and by skills can sort out on different places here, but distilling from analogous arenas what lessons from research are is another way to deal with this timing issue. And it's just to go to Jack's point, and then I promise to stop, because I have a problem with coming to conclusions, I admit it. And so I was thinking about that, and I thought that, the only way I could come to a conclusion is my conclusion would be, if you do this, something will happen that you don't anticipate. But I do think that part of our role actually can be to do that, which is not say this is the right thing or this is going to lead to this, but here are some likely problems, likely consequences that you need to be thinking about while you're making the decision, that we are in a position to provide that kind of guidance. And I don't think I want to necessarily turn it over to intermediaries. I'd like us to be doing that.
And if I can add to that just one point. Within our state, I'm very fortunate because higher education within our state understands the importance of improved K through 12 achievement if we're going to have students, or learning, if we're going to have students that are going to enter into our universities and are going to be able to graduate and get degrees within our state. So I've been able to be in a culture and environment where there's the understanding of the importance of the connection between K through 12 and college and career readiness. When our state went through a process of all of our universities being redesigned to create more rigorous teacher prep programs, we ended up having PK through 16 plus councils be created that involved arts and science faculty, College of Ed faculty, as well as K through 12 partners. And they were the ones who were involved in the redesign of the programs. And I can remember very vividly us bringing together arts and science, College of Ed, K through 12 teachers for meetings that were very content specific, and having K through 12 teachers arguing with university faculty in arts and sciences that their teacher preparation programs needed to have more rigorous content in the content areas than what they were receiving. And it was an eye-opener. And so that kind of exchange needs to go both ways, I think, where higher ed is sharing research about best practices, about research that can help to inform changes that might be occurring, but K through 12 needs to be involved in those discussions with the intent that we're creating students who are going to be college and career ready. So in our state, again, we still have that environment, that culture about the importance of new teachers coming out prepared to have students who are going to demonstrate college and career readiness. We've moved away from the councils. However, the discussions are still going on in various regions within our state as K through 12 and higher ed are coming together to have discussions about improvements that need to be made.
Michael?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. It's mainly going to be for Carl and Jack to try to answer this for me. But I was looking at some of the data, and the end of 2000, the most recent data I found was for 2013, and the annual expenditures by, let's just say, the top dozen think tanks that provide some kind of research-based evidence primarily oriented to policy issues is upwards of $2.5 billion. So as a recovering economist, I can't help but think that we should be thinking of this in terms of the supply side and the demand side. Somebody's asking for this kind of research-based evidence. And these think tanks include the ones that we're all familiar with: RAND, Brookings, FHI, SRI, the National Bureau of Economic Research, even throw in the National Research Council. So there is a demand side here, which I would like to ask Carl and Jack about, because you've both been mostly on the demand side, actually. And I heard a different kind of theme in what you were saying. I heard in Carl a metaphor about best bets, which suggests to me an evidentiary standard that has more to do with helping you get into a comfort zone about options you face in making decisions now for California. But I heard Jack argue for conclusions. And the funny part about that for me, Jack, is that I got to know Jack when he was in Congress and asked the Office of Technology Assessment to do a study of educational testing in the United States, which, by the way, I'm glad to say that was 1988, and the report has now cleared review. So leaving aside the timeliness question here, the point I want to make is that the Office of Technology Assessment doesn't exist anymore, but their approach to this was not to provide recommendations or even conclusions, but the approach was to say, here are the options that you have, and here's what we think is likely to happen if you follow one or another of these options. And that's a different kind of style and a different sort of tradition in trying to meet the demand. So I want to ask you both whether you want to comment on the extent to which the demand side for research-based evidence is actually looking for very definitive conclusions or is looking for something that can help make best bets, because that's going to make a difference to what we on the supply side do and how we frame the results for you.
Since today is the running of the Breeders' Cup races at Keeneland and Lexington, Kentucky, discussing bets is very important and front and center.
Timely.
I think part of what we're doing in California, and people say there is no second act in politics, but Governor Brown is really proving that wrong. I think it's a weariness. You know, he often talks about when he was a 35-year-old governor, he absolutely was convinced that he knew exactly how to improve things in California. The intervening 4 decades, which includes a tour as mayor of Oakland, state attorney general, he's realized that that 35-year-old was pretty much dead wrong. And so now it's more a weariness with dictates from on high pretending that they may have had research support, that he's now making this bet on the strength of people at the local level. One of the things that he also talks about that's very important for our state is the moral imperative to do the right thing with regard to youngsters who are poor, learning English, homeless, in foster care. And so in a sober moment, I would not pretend that I know that 1,000 flowers are going to bloom in terms of the return to local control. And whenever I'm here in Washington, as I was 6 months ago giving a talk at the Urban Institute, everyone is quick to remind me that this federal intrusion came about because the locals weren't getting it right originally with regard to how kids were being served. But I think it's, at this point, a bunch of older men realizing that we didn't know so much back when and are willing to make a guess, along with a lot of help from the research community about what we're attempting to do.
Well, Michael, I would take your point that there were alternatives given as conclusions. And so I'm not necessarily looking for one sentence, but some conclusion of what direction should you go, even if there's conditions on it. At least you'd understand what you would get if you went in one direction instead of another direction. And I'll give you an example. Now, my kind of work was that I worked on laws. I didn't work in school districts. I didn't work on best practice in school districts or states. We were revising the Vocational Education Act, and before every major act, I would ask the Library of Congress to give me every research study that they had or evaluation study in that particular area, and I would sit down and read them through. And the particular question at this point was that the academic standards movement was starting to gain momentum in California with Henig, with learning frameworks and so on. And I could see it building momentum, and the question was, how do you change vocational education to incorporate more academic content so that somebody can learn a trade and learn skills as well as learning in an applied setting possibly. And I looked through scads of research, and I could find about nothing that I could rely on and say, here's an approach that we could write in as an alternative for a state or as something for a state to do that would have some chance of success. I tried underlining things, I tried rephrasing things, I just couldn't find anything. And so that was my frustration, that I couldn't find a result. Now, with the money that's available today for planning, and I'm retired, I'm not affiliated with any group, I have no association, no connection with anybody. And I'll tell you what I think has happened in the foundation world, and that is that within the last 5 years or so, there's been a shift from making foundation money available for people to suggest ideas and things that should be pursued and possible solutions to things, to some major foundations having decided that there's certain answers and they want to give money to people to implement their answers. And I think there's been that type of shift. I don't think it's a healthy shift because some of these foundations have been wrong. And Bill Gates even admitted they made major mistakes with the high school initiative. And if somebody has that much money and they decide on an initiative, that's where people are going to go because they have to go for that money. And the last couple of years when I was raising money, foundations would say, well, we don't have money, go to Gates. Or Gates would say, well, we'll give you money if 3 other foundations join up with us. And so they'd all have to do the same thing. So there may be policy money available, but I wonder if the policy money isn't to implement somebody else's policy, not necessarily to think of policy objectively. And the best evaluations to me, Maris, were the people I dealt with on the Hill. They're suspicious people because maybe some of the things they do themselves, but they like to know who funded something and who's paying for this. And they're used to the tobacco lobby coming out talking about cigarettes. They're used to the bacon people coming out talking about bacon as a good product. And so when you come in with a study, they want to know, is it from the Department of Education? Is it from the unions? Is it from a business group? So you have to have independent funding if you can and no association connection if you can for the ideal study. And I don't think that's where the foundations are necessarily going right now.
And for 2 more questions, I think. Bruce?
So I'm Bruce Alberts from San Francisco. I'd like to ask Carl a question or raise an issue. I guess I want to just focus on the real world that I see around me in my field of science education. And we're all in favor of local control, but local control without any sophisticated ability to make wise judgments has been very wasteful and dangerous, in my opinion, because basically there's a whole world of commercial salesmen out there making promises. They're flooding school systems. Most of the school districts I know about are nothing like yours. I mean, not like Long Beach. And and they are easily fooled, especially since they're grasping for short-term. Everything's got to happen in 2 years, which is not going to. We're trying to implement the next generation science standards. It's a 10-year project, but nobody wants to admit that publicly. And so, I guess my real question is, how do we find a balance? And maybe that's what your organization is supposed to do. I mean, where there's available for school districts nonpartisan, research-based information about the alternatives, so that they don't, first of all, get fooled by hucksters, which happens way too often, and secondly, don't waste their time trying to reinvent the wheel. I see that all the time. Basically, you get a bunch of teachers together, you pay them for a year to write a piece of curriculum that matches the next generation science standards. Well, teachers are not good at writing curriculum. They could build on good curriculum. So I see lots of challenges for, I think, what you're trying to do, and I just wonder how you're going to try to approach these things.
Yeah, one of the things that the collaborative is going to do, we're going to be very rigorous in how we vet the technical assistance providers. And ever since I was appointed back on August 6th, I've been getting YouTube videos, all kinds of people knocking on the door, throwing things over the transoms. This is the best thing. And we're going to have just a very vigorous process. We're going to include we're going to have a couple of advisory committees that are going to help us on that process. But the people who are going to get through are the people who actually fully understand the philosophy behind this, who are committed to building capacity at the local level to own the improvement process. Whatever success Long Beach has had has been basically about the fact that you have local ownership of the improvement process that started back in the late 80s, early 90s, long before W came up with No Child Left Behind. You've had two superintendents over a 23-year period, and you have a community that absolutely is committed to being the owners, to improving the capacity of those at the local level. And the thinking is that we want to grow that throughout the state. But we're not naive, and you're right, every community isn't like Long Beach, but I don't see any reason why we can't grow that capacity at the local level throughout the state. That's what we're working on.
Carl, you know, I met last weekend with Superintendent's Roundtable. There's about 60 superintendents. And we had a long discussion, and they told me one of the major problems with instituting any type of change based on whatever research is that the average superintendent is around now for a year and a half to 2 years. And that you don't have any stability, any continuity, so how can you implement something? And so who's addressing that problem? And what can be done to stabilize leadership so that if something is good, it is in fact implemented and kept for a while?
Sure. It's certainly a legitimate problem. Whenever I talk to superintendents and school board members at national meetings, and I mention the fact that the really big gains in student achievement kicked in years 5 through 10 of my time in Long Beach. Everybody gets very nervous about that because everybody knows everything's built around a 4-year election cycle, and you start, if it doesn't happen, you start looking for another answer. But I think if we really want to do this right, and part of what Governor Brown is doing, it's a brilliant political stroke to, at the time that you're implementing Common Core, to also restore local control. Because all the crazies who would want to undermine Common Core, next generation science standards, they're completely at a loss when, you know, all we're talking about is in fact the restoration of local control. So I'm going to argue that gives California the time to reach more stability than other places would. But I think there's a huge payoff in terms of getting to that kind of stability, and perhaps more of what we need to do needs to be how we get that research in the public forum with the elected officials.
Last question.
Hello, my name is Ariel Bierbaum. I'm at UC Berkeley. One thing that seems to be implied, at least in this conversation, which we all know is not actually true, so I'm hoping you can talk a bit more about it, is that research or evidence is a monolith, but researchers are not apolitical actors, and the way we choose the questions that we ask, and particularly the way we choose the methods by which we answer those questions, mean something, right? They imply a particular epistemology and arguably a particular politic and a political stance. And so I'm wondering if you can speak at all to the sort of collision of the political economy of research. You started to talk about it in terms of who's funding your research, but even independent of funding, we're making choices across a set of methods that are raced and gendered and classed, and how that collides with the politics and the political economy of policymaking on the ground.
Great question.
Jeff will answer.
Just because I know we're anxious, I'll try to do it, but very briefly. I think the question is just a reminder of another reason why I think we just have to be careful about avoiding the notion that the way we respond to social needs or policy needs or other demands upon us as an enterprise is to sort of answer with a common answer. I think one of our strengths is that we do a lot of different things, including different methodologies animated by different philosophies. That means we're going to be internally divided, and that means our message out to the world is going to be somewhat less powerful at any given interval than it would be if we spoke in a common voice. But over the long run, since the politics around us changes, I think it's the safer and right route for us to cultivate the variance in approaches. And that means also cultivating research that isn't dependent on all the same funding sources, because funding sources constrain that as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to report that the session is almost over. So you get the last word, Jack, and I'll get the extra last word.
Okay. What I was trying to say is, if you're going to simplify something, to me, research being relevant to policy, at least the type of policy I dealt with, meant you had to have a conclusion, it had to be understandable, it had to be relevant, it had to be timely, it had to be understood it was in an environment, and it should be constantly reviewed. But the last point, I think it's a great point. People may be doing something that they're not aware of what they're doing because they're in a certain climate that reinforces that type of belief system. But when the results are presented to somebody who has a different type of belief system, they disregard them, which may be why sometimes conservatives do not accept liberal research. And so it will come down to, I think, self-policing on part of the research community, that you somehow assure people that you are in fact objective, that the questions aren't unintentionally culturally slated or ideologically slated. And so I think it may come down to self-policing, but it's wonderful to make people aware of the fact, because they may not even be aware that they have a bias. Michael, your last word.
No, my last word is after Bob.
So
Thanks to panel.
The last word is, this has been a very helpful panel, I think, and I stand by my conclusion. This is a glass half full panel, and please thank the group.
Just another word of thanks to this panel and a word of thanks to everybody. A wonderful meeting, a wonderful fellows retreat. We can't live by great ideas alone, so there is boxed lunch out there. And have a safe trip back, and we'll be in touch. Thank you all for a wonderful meeting.
Thank you.
Really good luck.
Thanks.
Well, it must be great to work for Jerry Brown. I have to say.
Absolutely, yeah.